Peace and love, my peoples. Peace and love. And of course, thank you for hitting that play button. I'm Imari D. This is Imari D TV, and you are watching episode number 2 of The Process, a complete overview of a portrait tattoo. And not only just any portrait tattoo, this portrait tattoo happens to be on dun 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 the hand. So without further ado, let's start off this video. So here's the tattoo we did. Let me just show you that first. This is the finished video we took of the tattoo. As you can see, everything is that, man. We did our thing, and it blends really well up into the rest of the tattoos on his arm. So of course, with every good tattoo, it always starts off with a design. And when it comes to doing portraits, getting the best reference image is always key. Fortunate enough for me, I was able to take the reference image myself of this particular person and create the design from that. So here are some of the images that I took. I took about 30 images. All of the images were taken on a Sony A6400, taken with a Tamron 16 to 60 millimeter lens. Now when I set up for this photo, I knew we wanted a profile view, so I set up a rim light, which is a light that's sitting on the back wall back there, and then it's a spot light hitting them right in the face. So if I was to scoot this camera over just another 2 or 3 inches, you would see a huge light sitting right here hitting them in the face. So we started off taking photos, and when I take reference photos, I take quite a few. So going through these photos, now you can see more of that spotlight and that rim light. What that rim light is doing is giving me that glow from the back. So like I said, we knew we wanted the face pointing a little bit down, and we wanted it blowing at a candle. So that's kind of what we were simulating here with setting up the imagery, and kind of had him leaning down in different positions, getting couple of different angles, seeing what looks best. Now it was around this point where I realized, man, I really like the profile view, but it'd be nice to have his face a little bit more tilted out so I can get some of that right eye in there and kind of give it more of a, I would say, a three-dimensional look versus a 2-dimensional side view. So I started taking pictures in the side view. I switched back over to a black and white filter, but then I realized I can just do the black and white in post. So eventually I switched back. Now when I switched back and was trying to get that side view, I realized how dark it was getting on this side of the face. Of course, I can go into Photoshop and tweak all of this, but I just really wanted to get a raw image and basically do little to no editing if I could. Just use that straight image, stencil it out, and get it going. So like I said, I took about 20 or 30 photos. Here's where I changed the angle of the light. This is where I started getting the photos I like. Changed the angle of the light. I changed the warmness in this image, kind of to give it more of a candle look or a glow look. But I didn't like that, and mostly because this tattoo is going to be black and gray already, I figured I might as well just take them in regular raw. Just shoot them regular raw with regular natural light. Nothing too cool, nothing too warm. I believe I used one of these last few images here, and as you can see, all of them are pretty similar. So yeah, I think one of these ones was the one I used. I want to say this one looks pretty close. So yeah, those are the images I took, and once I took the images, of course, I always take my images straight into Photoshop, and that's where I do all my designing. So in this particular tattoo, I was able to get a good video of what I do as far as design work in Photoshop. And we're gonna go in depth with this. So if you already know how to use Photoshop, already know how to design, then I guess you can skip ahead probably about 5-10 minutes, because that's how much time we're gonna spend on learning how to do a proper stencil. So for this particular image, this is the design I end up coming up with. I pretty much took that photo straight out of the camera, raw, threw it into Photoshop, and just cropped it out, dusted off the edges, added a little bit of smoke brushes, and added the candle. Well, it took me roughly hour to 30 minutes to knock this design out, just because I had such a good reference photo to begin with. Sometimes when you tattoo in portraits, you end up with a reference photo that is not so great. So here is the image superimposed over the hand. I always do this because it helps me get more of a realization on what the tattoo is going to look like. Of course, it's not going to look exactly like this, but this is what we're going for. We want it to fit like that. We want it to be on the hand and sit like that. And this is also the image I always send to the client, and give them just basically a preview of what it's going to look like in the long run. Getting into the design, I always do my design in Photoshop unless I'm drawing it directly on the hand. So when I come into Photoshop, I always duplicate my design once I have it in the Photoshop. And once I duplicate the design, I always go to filter, stylize, and then I hit find edges. Now this is going to find all the edges in my tattoo design for me. Notice how we're lacking a lot of detail, but it still did a pretty good job of getting me a foundation to start stenciling around. So this is always what I do, just to see what I get and what becomes. I always add that third layer as well, and that third layer is going to be what I use to actually draw on. So I'm drawing on that top layer. I'm creating a second layer, which is this stylized, this edge layer is what I guess I would call it. And then the third layer under it is my actual design and my reference, which I will be using for the actual tattoo. So of course I always go through it and I just play with this edge design, because sometimes I found that pulling the edges off of a design may leave you with the stencil and you don't have to do much work, especially if you're using an inkjet style printer, or an inkjet style stencil printer. Then of course it's going to be a little bit, you can kind of leave a lot of this detail and this shading in there. So once I get a solid layer of what I'm going to be doing for my stencil, I always open up a new layer, like I said, which is layer 1, and I start to stencil over it. Me personally, I like to use red, because if you use a color such as black and you start tattooing or you start stenciling out your image, it may run into some of the black you already have there. So I personally like using my own a red color or a green color or any really light color that I'm going to be able to see every line that I'm actually putting on the stencil. And for me, I always start the stencil off by looking for shapes. Of course, there are the obvious places you're going to line, which is that forehead down to the brow, down to the nose, to the upper lip, to the bottom lip, to the chin. That's just going to be somewhat of a hard edge, because that's where the face ends and begins at. So I always cut that line first when I'm stenciling, and then, like I said, I'm literally just going through looking for the shapes that work for me. So as you can see, I'm just kind of cutting through and finding those shapes. Now you can tell that right here I cut this shape out of the nose, because this is a heavy shadow, and I throw X's over my stencil just to show me when I'm tattooing where the highly concentrated areas are in the tattoo. So the X's kind of help me just navigate my stencil, especially if stuff starts rubbing off or getting a little bit blurry while I'm tattooing. It does help a little bit. So for me personally, when I'm tattooing, when I'm drawing, when I'm painting, when I'm doing any of those things, I'm always looking for the shapes of whatever I'm creating. And as you can see, I'm looking for the shapes of the highlight areas. I'm looking for the shapes of the shaded areas and the mid-tone areas as well. This shape right here pops out to me. I would want this on my reference for my tattoo stencil. Me personally, I don't like to make my stencils too complicated, as I've done that in the past, and it's really so much information that it didn't turn out as good as I wanted to. Now, with that being said, I do know artists who use stencils that I could never read, and it works for them. So you got to find your happy medium when you're creating stencils, and make sure whatever you create is legible for you. That stencil and the design is about 50 to 60% of the tattoo. If the design is trash, the tattoo is going to be trash. If 60% of the tattoo is the design, that makes 50% of the design is the stencil you create. So when creating a stencil, it is critical to make one that works for you, and that you can read throughout the whole tattoo process. This really comes down to you, man. You could do whatever you want with your stencil, just as long as it is legible. Now, with that being said, you never really want to make a stencil and add more than what you see in the image, because when you go to start tattooing that, it's going to be really hard to stay focused on what is actually there. So right now I'm just lining out some of those little white hairs out here in the black or in the saturated shadow area. And one thing I've learned with lining hairs is you just want to make a straight line. So one thing I've learned over the years is that stencils get messy once you print them. So doing this when you line the hair of a tattoo, and this could be for the hair of a human, this could be for the hair of an animal, this could be for the hair of a monster. You never really want to create this, I guess, this outline around the hair. And why I say that is because once you go to print your stencil and lay it on the skin, it's going to potentially smear. And when that happens and you got so many little hairs in here, your stencil is going to become a mess. So you can see how small those get once I start outlining the whole hair. My tip, my trick, my technique is always to just put a line over the hair and shade the outside of that line. So when you use it in your tattoo, you just want to basically line it and then go ahead and go around it with your shader. So once on the stencil, when you have the line, that's basically what you're doing. You're gonna be shading around that line, and then once you wipe, you're gonna have that hair right in the inside. I can probably do a video explaining the stencil a little better, but I'm just going through and trying to give you a basic view of how I create stencils. I don't want this video to be too long, and it's not really about the stencil. Although, once again, I will say your stencil is at least 25 to 35% of a good tattoo. So without a good stencil, you're not going to create a good tattoo. That's just in my opinion. So when you first getting started, practicing your stencils is key. Getting good stencils and practicing them is just good habit, and it's good to know. So like I said, I'm going through, I'm just adding lines where I see them, pulling out the shapes where I see them, getting all the information I need. And every now and then I mute that image layer, just check it and see if you got what you need, see if it's looking good, and this is looking good so far. And I just keep adding details. I just keep going back, making sure all the info is there, making sure all the details I need, zooming in and out. As you can see, I added those X's, but those X's look terrible. I think I went back and redid the X's on this stencil. Well, I know I went back and redid the X's on the stencil. So yeah, once again, the stencil is a critical part of the process. So just take your time. Don't rush it. No need to speed through it, because this is going to be your roadmap for a good tattoo. So like I said, I continuously pull out my shadows, my highlights. That's one of the things that I'm doing here. It's just pulling shadows and I'm pulling highlights and shaping them out. And here you go. So yeah, you can see I did some much smoother, much cleaner X's in my saturated black areas. So just going through and adding all the information I need to get to where I need to go. And that's pretty much the stencil. Here I added a hard line to where that brow comes down to the nose, comes down to the upper lip, to the bottom lip, to the chin. I added that hard line simply because I wanted it to be a very dark line on my stencil. So if you find any part of your stencil that you really wanted to have more of a thick and dark line, just go ahead and increase your brush size and hit those areas where you want them to be darker. I do this in quite a few little areas here. I think I do it right here over the eye. Yeah, just hitting it with those areas, throwing the eyebrows in. Like I said, just creating all the information I need for my tattoo. Once I finish drawing the stencil, I always take my line work and I duplicate it. I first duplicate my line work, so that way I have one that I'm going to keep red and one that I'm going to turn black for my stencil print, actually. So what I usually do is I go up to color balance, or I'm sorry, I go up to black and white when I do this in Photoshop. I go to black and white, and then I click on the reds and I take them all the way to black. It's basically it. You can see it turned all the red lines to black, and now that stencil is basically ready to print. Now I have 4 layers for this stencil. I have my red lines, I have my black lines, which I'm going to print with, I have that edge layer, and I have my layer, which is the reference that I'm going to be using. Now all of these layers can help you while you're tattooing. Me personally, I just go off the reference, and sometimes I use those red guidelines to continuously look back. And so once again, that is my stencil process, a quick overview. I believe I'll probably make a much more in-depth and just a longer video on the stencil and process of getting it all together. So moving on from the stencil, we go straight into the setup, and here is what I use. All right, so this is the pre-setup, right? I don't think I got my ink cups out, but I go through my inks and what I'm using as far as needle groupings and everything. So the needle groupings I put out first to start with is a 5-round shader. Here is a 9-round shader. It is a standard, nothing special about it. My next needle I always use with portraits is an 11 mag, and honestly this is a needle I use almost for everything. It's just such a versatile needle. It gets me into really small spaces, and I can do some heavy or large area shading as well with it. And of course for this portrait I used a 3-round liner as well. As you can see on my table here, I'm using raw tattoo inks, and right now I'm using a cool gray, an opaque gray medium. I put out a true white, but I didn't use any white in this tattoo. And just depending on how everything heals up, we may add white, but I've found that putting white into hand tattoos, sometimes it just don't really hold up. So for the most part, I kind of wanted to go with more of the skin as the highlights, so negative space more so as highlights than anything. Also using a Venta Black from Raw Ink, Raw Tattoo Pigments, make awesome inks. It's all natural, vegan friendly, lays really well, and it heals amazingly. I'm also using Electrum stencil gel, and I'm using some of the stencil solution from Eco Stencils. Here I'm using Fly High Tattoo Artist Glide. I use petroleum jelly only for putting my ink caps, sticking them to my tray. I don't use this on the skin. I don't use it in the tattoo. I always use Artist Glide. It's all natural, vegan friendly, and this one happens to be hemp infused, and it smells amazing. I use shop towels for preparation, cleaning my machine, etc. And I use cotton swabs. Now these particular cotton swabs are woven cotton swabs. You can get them at Walmart. I honestly looked all over line. I don't know where else to find them. If you know where I can get these in like wholesale bulk, that would be awesome. Drop a link, drop a comment below. But unfortunately right now, the only place I can find these particular cotton rounds These ones here is at Walmart. Each tattoo I do, depending on if it's black or gray or color, black and gray tattoos, maybe about 50 of them I'll use. Color tattoo, maybe about 150. So it's completely worth it, especially when you're using these, because I find that when I use these, they soak up the ink instead of smearing it. So it absorbs a bit more of the ink instead of smearing it, and it gives me it just preserves my stencil a little bit better. So once again, that's the Fly High I use, the Electrum stencil gel, and the stencil prep solution is what it's called. There we go. I'm using the alcohol to clean and prep the skin, and of course I have my biodegradable ink cups right there. And yeah, that's my setup there. Biodegradable ink cups, cotton swabs. Here I have my green soap. Here I have some distilled water, and here I have Bactine. Now, when I'm tattooing, about 70% of the tattoo, I'm just using water. It seems to be a little bit better on the skin than using soap the whole time. Sorry, this isn't green soap. This is Dr. Bronner's lavender soap. So this is lavender soap. This is water, and this is Bactine. And like I said, about 75% of the tattoo I'm using the water bottle. I want to say about 15% of the tattoo is done with the soap, and about 10 to 5%, anywhere from there, I'll say 10% is done with the Bactine. I hit it with Bactine probably every hour or two, just to kind of give it that soothing feel, as well as bring some of the swelling and inflammation down. I'm using a biodegradable razor. I'm also using a biodegradable rinse cup. So this is my setup. This is how it looks. As you can see, I got my camera set up, my lights, and then this is my tray. On to the application. So I will say this right before we get into these videos, guys, and I wanna just make this known. I recorded this full process. I time-lapsed this whole tattoo specifically for this video, and just being hasty and too ahead of myself, I didn't set my settings up right. So all of these videos are a little bit blurry, a little bit grainy, but I think they'll work for the purposes. I did, however, get a lot of in-between videos that are really crispy, really clean. So I'll be supplementing those with some of the bad videos and trying to just give you a general overview of how I lay down the complete tattoo. So here is the actual video of me chopping up the stencil. If you've never if you never laid a stencil, then you are, or if you ever have laid a stencil, then you already know that one, paper is flat, two, the body is not. So you're gonna have to kind of cut some grooves into your stencil to get it to sit the way you want it to sit on the body. Now, stencil doesn't have to be completely 100% perfect, as long as it's readable for you. Can't get enough of saying that. As long as you can understand what is going on, then it's a-okay. So cut some grooves into your stencil. Make sure it's bendable. Make sure it can wrap and curve around the skin. Here's me laying the stencil. Like I said, once again, forgive me for all the grainy video. I will be doing more videos like this, and I will be catching some high definition video for you guys. Make sure my settings is right next time. Either way, here's me laying the stencil. I go ahead and clean the whole hand with a little bit of soap and water. Make sure I get it all scrubbed down, and then I start shaving it. Shaving any little hairs and just whatever I see. Because the one thing you don't want when you're tattooing is one of those little hairs getting stuck in between one of your needles and throwing off your lines or throwing off some of your shading. Also, there's the potential for ingrown hairs if you don't shave all the hairs off. Now, that's not everybody, but some people do have more coarse hair when it grows back and it gets a bit more sensitive. So just make sure you shave, take your time, especially take your time with people's bodies, because sometimes they could be sensitive, and you definitely don't want to go nicking them before you actually start the tattoo. So shave it up, make sure it's all good to go. I hit it with some alcohol after I'm done shaving it. Make sure it's all clean and dry. This is where I start applying the stencil prep. You can see the video is super blurry, but this is where I apply the stencil prep. So like I said, I use inkjet stencil printers, and I'm telling you, man, like, craziest thing. So if you do not put this prep on before you put your stencil solution on, the stencil will not stick to the skin. I don't know what kind of magic they do in here, but they have really created a market to where they can sell this prep, and you need it for sure. So after you apply the prep, I dab it off a little bit, make sure it's not too moist, because you kind of want that to seep into the skin, kind of dry, and right before we apply the actual stencil solution. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're applying your stencil, you never want your stencil to be wet or drippy or beading or anything. You want it to be nice and even over the whole surface. Also, I like my solution a little bit tacky. That way the paper sticks to where I put it to, and it's not sliding around anywhere. So as you can see, I'm really working that solution into his hand, setting it up to place the stencil properly, making sure his hand is flat and straight. That way when he goes to relax his hand and show the tattoo, it's not off. It's in the right place and it looks right. So some people like to add little lines on the tattoo to give them guidance. Me personally, since I did the design right over the hand, I knew exactly how this was gonna fit. We printed the stencil to fit exactly perfectly, so all I had to do was find one edge and lay it out from there. And you can see I put the candle down on that first finger first, because everything after that should follow and line up perfectly, just because of the way we did the stencil. So I start dabbing the stencil down, and then I start applying even pressure from the center out. Now this is I would say this is a pretty critical point. So just take your time and make sure you're doing it right. Take your time, make sure you applying even pressure throughout the whole stencil, especially on this hand area, because it's so many little curves and divots that these edges aren't really going to get a good stick. So you got to keep that pressure on them, keep smoothing it over. And you can see it's just a slow process. I'm going over it and I'm making sure that everything is laid on. Now I usually take a cotton swab and I dab in a little bit of water over the edges, and as you can see, I peel it back and the stencil is there. Now let me show you an actual video of the stencil, that way you guys can see it a little bit better. So that is the stencil we laid down. As you can see, it came out really nice. And here is what I was talking about earlier, when it gets a little muddy. Now all this information, when we printed that stencil and you saw it, it didn't have all of this in there. This is just from laying the stencil down. Let me see, I have a video of me mixing the actual inks. So when I create tattoos, I always mix my own gray washes. Even if it's an opaque gray wash, I always mix my own. And you can see here, and that first cup is going to be purely black. Just the Venta black I'm putting in there. The second one's going to be about 5 to 6 drops of black in that second cup, maybe 8. The third one's going to be about 4 or 5, maybe 3. I think I put 3 in that one and 2 in this one. And the last one is going to be reserved strictly for water. Now here's where my mixing gets a little different than most people. I like to add opaque grays to my gray washes. So that second cup, I'm adding about 6 to 7 drops of the dark opaque. The second cup, I add about 3 to 4 drops of dark opaque. And then I come in with a lighter opaque gray and add about 3 or 4 drops to the second cup. and about 4 or 5 drops to the first cup. That's how I make my blend down. Everything else is going to be distilled water I'm putting in here. And I fill each cup up all the way up to the top. And the last cup, like I said, is distilled water. Since I decided not to put any white highlights in this tattoo, we're just gonna use water for a mix down cup. So I use my little mixer, I spin that bad boy, get that gradient, get those pigments mixed up in there, make sure everything is broken down, and I'm getting a consistent, even flow of the same ink over my needle every time I dip. So here you can see, let me pause it here. You can see the gradient breakdown here. This is the lightest one, which has a really bad highlight on it, so it doesn't look that great. But you can see this one gets a little darker, all the way down to my black. This is just my preference of making a gray wash, as in having those gray tones in the background really gives it a bit more of a smoother feel. So yeah, getting into the process of tattooing, we laid the stencil, we got our inks poured out, we ready to go. I got my needles set up, I got everything ready to go, and from there I just kind of start tattooing. Once again, guys, please bear with me. These videos are not the best quality. They were recorded in the wrong format, but like I said, I believe they will still work. I usually start from one corner and work my way through the whole tattoo. If I can, I'm gonna start from the right side. Since I am right-handed, it does help me with smudging and smearing, because your hand is gonna be running over the area you already tattooed. Now if I started from the left, I'm gonna be bringing my hand back across my tattoo in areas that I haven't tattooed yet, which would in turn pretty much wipe my stencil away. So as you can see, I start from the right corner and kind of work my way around. Right here, I'm just lining some of the edges, lining some of that candle, putting some blood lines in is what they're called. So this is my number one opaque gray I'm using right now. So this is the lightest gray I made that I'm putting in right now, and just kind of lining things in. These lines, if they were to heal, wouldn't probably stay. They would, if they did, they would be very, very, very faint. So these are the kind of lines I use to kind of guide me through, at least as I go. So my process of tattooing is to line a little bit, shade a little bit, line a little bit, shade a little bit. A lot of this tattoo was done with the 11 mag, just cornering it and flipping it and moving it sideways. Here you can see I'm just kind of hitting some of these little lines in the areas I think my hand is really gonna be bumping into it, and then I go in and I start magging things in. My process for tattooing is just a sweep in motion back and forth. It's called a pendulum technique. I heard that online somewhere from another YouTuber. He called it the pendulum technique, and I liked it. I'm like, I'm gonna use that, and I wish I remembered his name, because I would shout him out at this point. But just a sweep in motion is really what I'm doing here. Is going back and forth, getting those gradients in, making sure I'm getting my blends, making sure I'm getting my sweeps and stuff. So here I'm packing in that black that's under the chin. And when I pack black, I usually like to use more of a circular motion, and you'll see here. So I'm using kind of more of my hand in a circular motion and kind of pushing that ink in really heavy there. Moving forward, just lining and shading, back and forth. And like I said, I always kind of start a little bit more on the line edge and go up to that edge, and then I'll line a bit more. This not only helps me keep track of my stencil doing it this way, it also helps with pain and inflammation of the tattoo. And if we were to go through and add all the blood lines first, and then start shading, that means we'd be coming back up to the top area up here in 2 or 3 hours and shading that after we had already lined it. So it would probably already start swelling, be inflamed, and we would have a bit of issue pushing good ink into that area of skin. So going through, As you can see, this is about an hour into the tattoo. An hour and 10 minutes into the tattoos, and you can see where we're at about right there. We got about most of the background in, some of the face. Let's see, next video. This is hour 2. Just going through and same technique. Line a little bit here, shading a little bit here. So I think around right here is where I start taking these external videos with the other camera and kind of get a better view of what I'm doing as far as creating and shading. So if you see, this is more of a close-up view, just basically taking the edge of my needle there and touching the skin lightly. I'm basically getting in there and doing some light touching to the skin, adding layers. So that's the key thing with portrait tattoos, is layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. So keep adding layers until you get that smooth gradient that you want, and then continue to move on. It's just a slow process. Right here I'm cutting into some hairs with the side of my 11 mag, just getting in there, trying to pull shapes is basically what I'm doing. Once again, I'm trying to follow my lines and just pull the shapes out that I see. Here's a bit closer view of it. As you can see, I still got some of the shading to do over here. I got my line here, and all of this is just basically mag work. The less trauma on the skin, the longer you can work, the better you can shade, the more gradients you can put in, etc., etc., etc. The less trauma, the better. It's basically what it really comes down to. In this particular time lapse or real-time video, got a lot of the tattoo in, and I'm working on areas, just shading everything in. Yeah, with any portrait tattoo, when you start it, first off, it's gonna look like trash. You keep adding layers, keep shading, keep putting in the information that you have in your reference, and eventually it's gonna start looking like the portrait and the piece that you want it to look like. So here I'm just, like I said, going over and adding. You can see we had a lot of the face and the nose done in this particular video. We're probably about 3.5 hours in at this point. I want to say a little over 3.5 hours in at this point. And really what I'm doing right now is I'm bringing everything together. I'm tightening everything up. I put in all my basic shapes already. Now it's just going through and tightening things up, making sure everything is cohesive, everything looks good, and everything is together. So here is me working on the back of that hand, putting in more of those little hairs, just doing it all with the 11 mag. I'm getting it in. I'm shading around those little lines that I told you guys about. Shading up the side of that hand, kind of connecting his old tattoos with the new tattoos, making sure everything is cohesive. So here we get into, man, the final stages of tattooing this particular piece. But right now I'm just going through and I'm adding details. I'm adding little details here and there, tightening things up, tightening little areas up, making sure we got everything in. I think at this point we're probably about four hours in, maybe 4 hours and 20 minutes into the tattoo. Really at this point we're at the point where we're just cleaning stuff up and making sure everything looks good. Now in some cases, in some tattoos, this is a time where I may start adding highlights as well as cleaning things up. But in this particular tattoo, I decided not to do any white highlights. I just wanted to leave the negative space for the skin as highlights, and I think it turned out a much better. So just going through and cleaning stuff up, getting everything looking good, getting everything crispy, and yeah. Basically the process, man. That is the process. I wish the video was a little bit more clear. That way you could see more of my hand motion and more of what the gradients I'm actually hitting look like. So the next video I will definitely make sure to get the proper quality that is needed. when we finish, man, when you finish tightening everything up, this is the hardest part, is calling it done, and sometimes the skin is gonna call it done for you, because I could probably keep going in here and just adding dots and little tightenings and everything, but I decided that probably, I think we went for another 5 minutes here, and I decided, yeah, that's it, man, we finished. So looked really good. I cleaned them up. Let's see, here it is. That's what it looks like. Yeah, came out really nice. We may do a second pass on this tattoo, just depends on how everything heals up. And in that second pass, I may decide to add whites to it. But I think the skin, as far as the skin and the negative space goes, I think it's gonna heal up really nice. It blends in really nice with his other tattoos he has going up his arm. So yeah, it's just, at this point, it's a game of seeing what it looks like once it's completely healed. After the tattoo is completely done, you can see his hands a little swollen. It's ready to be bandaged. I always use Derma Shield for my bandaging. I've been using this for about the last 1.5 years now. Super amazing, and they are basically a self-healing adhesive bandage that you can leave on for up to 4 or 5 days. The most critical part of a tattoo healing is probably that first 3 to 5 days. That's when it's just literally a raw and open wound. So you got to be real careful with it. You got to be real mindful of it, especially on the hand, digging in your pockets, all that stuff. So these patches really help with that. As you can see, I applied a thin layer of Fly High over the top of the tattoo before I add the bandage. And once I add the bandage, I just lay it over the same way I kind of laid a stencil, and just make sure it's covering the whole tattoo, wrapping around, and it's got a good grip. Now on the hand, it may come off, but that's okay, right? Like, I know that in this particular case, this client, he's gonna take this off probably in about 48 hours. So it's not gonna be on that for too long. And yeah, basically just lay it down, make sure it's all good and on there. I cut a few more little pieces just for the edges as well, or the fingers as well. Yeah, and that is the tattoo all wrapped up. I think that's it, man. I think that's pretty much everything in the overview. Once again, here is the tattoo. It's what it looks like at the final stages. Like I said, we may hit this with another pass. Just depends on how everything heals up. But I think it looks amazing. Once again, I hope you guys got something out of this. I hope this helped some of you guys. If you have any questions, comments, go ahead and drop a comment below. If you would like to see more of these videos, subscribe, because I'll be making a lot more of these videos, and I promise next time that the quality of the time lapse will be a lot better. So once again, I appreciate you guys for stopping by, clicking that play button. I hope this helps some of you guys. If any of you have critiques for me or constructive criticism, please drop a comment. I would love to hear it. And yeah, I appreciate you watching. Go out there, get your tattoo on. Peace and love.